We've given Ted the choice to be a good friend and invite his neighbor Rick to church, or tend a colony of angry bees. What'll it be, Ted?
I choose the bees, Carl.
All righty, Ted. Precise and slow movements discourage the fear pheromone in the queen bee.
So I just pull this out to inspect the bees?
Bingo. You're going to want to avoid making direct eye contact. These little guys view that as an act of aggression. You know, once the colony begins to swarm, Ted, are you sweating?
I have a condition.
Wish you would have disclosed this earlier. Bees interpret sweat as hostility.
They're in my pants. They're in my pants. They're in my pants. They're in my pants.
Stand down! Stand down! Get in there, Betty. Stand down!
Hey, Rick. You want to go to church with me?
Yeah, why don't we swing by the hospital first?
That'd be real nice.
You know, it was unthinkable that a small, despised movement from the corner of Palestine could move out to become the dominant faith of the mighty Roman Empire. An empire that was steeped in fiercely defended traditional pagan religions. The spread of the Christian church in its earliest centuries is one of the most amazing phenomena in all of human history. The church was considered an illegal and depraved religion. Wave after wave of persecution was unleashed to try to squash it. At least two of the persecutions were empire-wide, intended to completely destroy the church. Yet here we are today. Robert Louis Wilkin, emeritus professor of history at the University of Virginia, has estimated the number of Christians in the first few centuries of the church, and he writes and says, at the end of the first century, there were fewer than 10,000 Christians in the Roman Empire. The population at that time numbered some 60 million, which meant that Christians made up 1/100 of 1%, according to the figures of a contemporary sociologist. By the year 200, the number may have increased to little more than 200,000, but still a tiny minority, under 1%. By the year 250, however, the number had risen to more than 1 million, almost 2% of the population. But the most striking figure, he says, however, comes to 2 generations later. By the year 300, Christians made up 10% of the population, approximately 6 million believers in the Holy Roman Empire. So how did this young fledgling movement make it? Well, the growth of the church was a natural result of the believers' devotion to God, to teaching, to fellowship, and to service. The proclamation of the gospel. In Acts chapter 2, we read these words, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and miraculous signs were done by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. Selling their possessions and goods, they gave to anyone as he had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread together in their homes. They ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. You see, sharing the gospel isn't just a duty. It's a natural outflow of a transformed life. So let's take a few moments this morning to see how the gospel was making a difference in the early church. And as we begin, the early church felt the power that is in the gospel. Again, verse 47 read, and the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. You see, the early church didn't grow because of some marketing or some great strategic plan. It grew because the gospel itself has power. Paul talked about that in Romans chapter 1. He said, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, first for the Jew and also for the Greek. Theologian James Edward retells the following true story from Korea. It was in August of 1957. Four climbers, two Italians and two Germans, were climbing the 6,000-foot near vertical north face of the Swiss Alps. And so the two German climbers disappeared and were never heard from again. The two Italian climbers, though, exhausted and dying, were stuck on two narrow ledges 1,000 feet below the summit. Well, the Swiss Alpine Club forbade rescue attempts in that part of the mountains because it was plain and simply just too dangerous. But a small group of Swiss climbers decided that they were going to launch a private rescue effort in order to save these two Italians. So they carefully lowered a climber named Alfred Hellepart down the 6,000-foot north face. They suspended Hellepart on a cable a fraction of an inch thick as they lowered him into the abyss. And here's how he tells the story and describes the rescue in his own words. He said, "As I was lowered down the summit, my comrades on top grew further and further distant until they completely disappeared. At that moment, I felt an indescribable aloneness. Then, for the first time, I peered down the abyss of the north face, and the terror of the sight robbed me of breath. The brooding blackness of the face, falling away in almost endless expanse beneath me, made me look with awful longing to the thin cable disappearing about me in the mist. I was a tiny human being dangling in space between heaven and hell. The sole relief from my terror was my mission to save the climber below." James Edwards applied the story to our own lives, and he said, that is the heart of the gospel story. We were trapped, but in the person and presence of Jesus, God lowered himself into the abyss of our sin and suffering. In Jesus, God became a tiny human being dangling between heaven and hell. He did it to save the people trapped below, you and me. Thus, the gospel is much more radical than just another religion telling us how to be good on our own power. It tells us the story of God's risky, costly, sacrificial rescue on our behalf. You know, when we faithfully share the gospel, we trust in its inherent power to change lives. We don't trust in our own abilities. The power of the gospel, you see, is stronger than any blockade or wall or barrier that mankind can build. The good news of grace can convert hearts. It alters lives and it transforms entire communities, as it did in the early church, by bringing hope and healing and the promise of eternal life through Jesus Christ. Well, you know, second this morning, the early church had a visible witness. In Acts 2:47, we read, they were praising God and enjoying all the favor of all the people. You know, when I think about the early church, I can't help but to start to realize, you know, they were living their faith on public display for everyone to see. People in Jerusalem were noticing this little group of believers. These believers had a powerful witness, a visible witness, so much so that they enjoyed the favor of all the people in Jerusalem. The believers' actions and unity and devotion were on public display for everyone around them. They shared their lives together, which made the gospel message believable and attractive. You know, it's hard to think and it's hard to live our lives when we're on public display for everyone to see. You know, when I worked at the big bank branch in Christiansburg, it was nothing short of nerve-wracking at times. The big branch there on Arbor Drive at the time was the corporate headquarters branch, and so the branch was located on the first floor. Behind the branch, you had the commercial banking department. There was also a set of offices there too. Operations was in the back left half of the first floor. Second floor was HR. You never want to really be around HR if you don't have to be. The third floor was training and development. The fourth floor, though, at the very top of the building, was the bank president's suite. And that's where all the bank executives were. coming and going at any given time. It was nothing to have any number of high-profile customers and employees come through the branch to have their business transacted. Everything we did had to be of a higher quality, as we were under constant scrutiny. We always joked, we worked in a fishbowl. Everybody saw what we did. Everything was on full display, the good, the bad, even the ugly. If a customer thought they were not treated the way they should be, all they had to do was get on the elevator and go right up to the 4th floor and file a complaint at the president's office. And I can tell you that happened more times than what we really wanted. It also didn't happen very often, though, that the other happened, where they went up to brag about us. That just didn't happen as much as what we would like. But, I say all of that, and I tell all of that because when I first began working at the branch there in 2007, I was terrified of making mistakes or saying the wrong thing and upsetting the wrong customer because everybody would know what had happened. I learned, though, that if I did my job correctly and if I did it to the best of my ability, I followed bank policy and procedure, really I didn't have anything to worry about. And I think it's true for the early Christians. They were following Jesus and his teaching, showing love and compassion and grace to each other and to their community. And the community noticed. The believers found favor with all the people. There was nothing that could be said against the early Christians. It reminds me a whole lot of what Jesus said and taught us in Matthew chapter 5. Jesus said this, he said, "Let your light shine so before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." This morning, we have to ask ourselves, how are we living our lives? Do we act one way at church and then completely different at home? How about how we act at work? The jokes we tell, the things we say. How about at youth sporting events? Do we enjoy the favor of all the people? Or are we living hypocritical lives? You see, our lives should be a living testimony to the gospel, making people want to know more about Jesus through the way that we live, the way that we serve, and the way that we love one another. In the early church, there was also a boldness in their sharing. Number 3. The early Christians were not passive about their faith. The story is told of Kim Duk-soo in Korea. And it said that he will never forget November 20th, 1950. That was the day the communist troops found him hiding with his father in a root cellar. Kim is now an administrator of a Presbyterian hospital in Daegu, but he still has the difficulty of telling his story. And he's not the only one. Hundreds of thousands of Christians made up the human wave escaping North Korea or the Free South. And each had a similar story of deliverance from a regime that opposed religion. And so when Kim tells his story, there are tears in his eyes, and he said, "When we heard the soldiers were coming, I was sure we would be killed. My daddy told me we would not tell a lie to save our lives." Well, his father had pastored a church for 42 years in Korea. He had helped his wife hide their children by covering them with rice bags and dirt. But after 2 days of hiding, Kim uncovered himself. And just then the communist troops approached the house. Kim and his father ran back to the backyard and to hide in the root cellar. And he said, "I told God and I begged God that I would serve him all my life if I got out of that root cellar alive." Well, the communist soldiers found Kim and his father, and they took him to a makeshift prison. They were scheduled to be executed the next morning. That evening, though, a captain approached Kim and said, "Are you a Christian?" For a fleeting moment, he said life for a lie seemed like the only logical way to go. But the young boy remembered his father's instructions, and so he answered, "I am a Christian." Well, the captain drew closer, and he whispered in his ear, "I am a Christian too. I used to be a Sunday school teacher before the war. You must escape tonight. I will help you." Kim fled that night, having to leave his father under heavy guard, awaiting his eventual death. The young Kim, though, reached an American Army base, and while he was hanging around there, he discovered an organ. He began teaching himself to play music. An American he remembers only as Captain Shoemaker learned of his musical interests and ordered a spinet organ to be sent from the United States. Well, for the next 10 years, Kim played that organ for chapel services at the base. Well, today at First Presbyterian Church in Daegu, Korea, you can hear an organ as 2,000 Korean voices sing together grand old hymns of the faith. As he has done for 30 years, Kim plays the organ, and he said, "I should have been killed after the communists found me, but God sent a Christian guard to help me escape. When I play the organ at the church, I am doing it for God." Kim Duk-soo was not ashamed of the gospel. He boldly shared his faith, just like the early church did. You know, just a few chapters over in the book of Acts, in chapter 4, Peter and John are preaching the good news, and the temple priests and guards and Sadducees, well, they were all upset about the gospel message that Peter and John were proclaiming. They were also upset by the fact that there were so many listening and believing to what Peter and John were saying, and so they arrested Peter and John. And the next day they were brought before the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem to be questioned about their actions, and Peter and John explained their message, which was absolutely not received well by the rulers and the teachers of the law. And so the authorities threatened Peter and John to stop talking about this Jesus and stop spreading this message that Jesus had risen from the dead. Stop it, they told them. But Peter and John were not fazed. In Acts chapter 4, verses 19 and 20, we're told that Peter and John replied, "Judge for yourselves whether it is right in God's sight to obey you rather than God. For we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard." The Spirit's empowerment led them to share the gospel boldly, even in the face of persecution. Do we have that kind of bravery? Do we speak of Jesus with boldness? Do we share the gospel with authority and courage? You know, we're called to step out in boldness, trusting that God will give us the words we need to speak. Well, fourth this morning, the early church lived an everyday evangelism. You know, in the early church, the good news of the gospel was not shared just on special days or in special places. It happened every day. Evangelism, you know, the sharing of the gospel isn't just for preachers or missionaries. It's for everyone, every day, in everyday places. You know, consider the life of D.L. Moody, probably one of the most famous 19th century American evangelists. Moody was originally a shoe salesman in a shoe store. But he lived out his faith in simple, everyday ways that had a profound impact on others. You know, one pivotal moment in his life came when a Sunday school teacher named Edward Kimball visited him at his workplace. Edward Kimball had a burden to share the gospel message with him, and so he did. And Kimball's act of sharing Christ in the shoe store eventually led to Moody's conversion. Moody, in turn, became a world-renowned evangelist, preaching to millions across the world. But what's remarkable about D.L. Moody is that he continued to live out an everyday evangelism in his life, even as his influence grew. He would approach strangers in everyday situations, on the street, in the park, or while traveling, and share the gospel message with them. He even made a commitment that he would not go to bed any night without having shared the gospel with at least one person that day. His dedication shows that evangelism wasn't something reserved for big events or revival settings or organized efforts. It was part of his daily life. One account tells that he was sitting in a restaurant one time when he felt prompted to talk to a man about Jesus. He initially didn't want to do it. He was reluctant, but he went ahead and he went over and he shared the gospel, and it made a difference, and it was a turning point for that man's life. And, his life is filled with stories that illustrate this. The power of being intentional about sharing Christ in the ordinary moments of life. His legacy reminds us that everyday evangelism is often about small and faithful steps that God can use to make an extraordinary difference. That's exactly what Paul was talking about in Colossians chapter 4. He writes and he says, "Devote yourselves to prayer and to being watchful and thankful." And he says, "And pray for us too, that God may open a door for our message so that we may proclaim the message of Christ, for which I am in chains. Pray that I may proclaim it clearly as I should. Be wise in the way you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation always be filled with grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone." You see, we need to live every day being ready and watchful for those opportunities to share God's love and grace. When those opportunities present themselves, we must be ready to make the most of that opportunity. Are we ready today? It starts by making sure that our hearts are filled with God's love. When we live out God's love in our daily lives, we cannot help but share God's love and grace with all with whom we come in contact. Sharing the gospel is as much part of our daily lives as any other routine in our daily lives. At work, at home, in our neighborhoods, in simple conversations that we have. I pray that we're ready and willing to share. Finally, this morning, the early church trusted God for the results. Acts 2:47 said, "The Lord added to their number daily." The believer's role was to share the gospel. But it was God who brought about the transformation and added to their numbers. Stuart Briscoe preached his first sermon at age 17. He didn't know much about the topic he was assigned to him by the elder in his church, but he researched it and researched the church of Ephesus until he had a pile of notes and 3 points as seemed proper for a sermon. Well, I guess I'm not proper this morning. I have 5 for you. But anyways, he stood there before the brethren in a British gospel hall and he began to preach his message. And he preached, and preached. He kept on preaching until he had used up all of his allotted time, and he just kept on going until he reached the end of his first point. And then he still kept going until he finally looked up from his notes and made a confession. He said, "I'm terribly sorry. I don't know how to stop." And he recalled in his memoir that a man in the back of the church stood up and shouted out, "Just shut up and sit down." No one say that. That might have been the end of his preaching career, but he was invited back the next week. And he continued to preach for the next 7 decades. In the process, he became a better preacher, discovered he had a gift, and was encouraged to develop it. And he ultimately preached to more than 100 countries around the world, including ours. When he died on August the 3rd, 2022, at the age of 91, he was known as a great preacher who spoke with clarity, loved the people that he preached to, and had a deep trust in the work of the Holy Spirit. I tell you all of that because he wrote this one time. He said, "My primary concern in preaching is to glorify God through his Son. I've worked hard to preach effectively, but I've learned to trust as well. Farmers plow their lands, plant their seed, and then they go home to bed, awaiting God's germinating laws to work. Surgeons only cut, God heals. I must give my full energy to doing my part in the pulpit, but the ultimate success of my preaching rests in God." That's exactly how Paul felt. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, he wrote this. He said, I planted the seed, that is Paul saying this, but Apollos watered it, but God made it grow. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God, which makes all things grow. The man who plants and the man who waters have one purpose, and each will be rewarded according to his own labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. You know, this morning we have been given the seeds of the gospel to share. Our job is to spread that seed as far and as wide as we possibly can. It's a full-time calling for the believer. The seed is spread by our words, by our lives, by our actions, by our example. We have to water the seed, praying that God will allow the seed to take root and to sprout. But you know, that's as far as we can go. The rest is completely up to God and the Holy Spirit. We plant the seeds by sharing the gospel, but we trust God to bring about the harvest. You know, this morning, sharing the gospel is part of being devoted together. It's not just about words, but about how we live and interact with our world. It's been a while back, but one time I shared with you guys a video that illustrated what was called the marshmallow test. Remember that? It's a classic research project that illustrates our lack of self-control and delayed gratification. For the study, you see, the researcher would give a child a marshmallow and tell them they could eat the marshmallow, or they could wait until the researcher came back several minutes later, at which time they would get a second marshmallow. Remember that kind of illustration? Okay. So in January 2020, the results of a new version of the experiment were released. And so in this version, kids were paired up together. They would play for a while together, play a game together, kind of to get to know each other. And then they were sent to a room and given a cookie with the promise of another if they could wait for it by not eating the first cookie. However, some of the kids were put into what researchers called an interdependent situation, in which they were told they would only get the second cookie if they and their partner could wait and refrain from eating. Well, the results showed that the kids who were depending on each other waited for the second cookie significantly more often. According to researcher Rebecca Kuhlman, in this study, children may have been motivated to delay gratification because they felt they shouldn't let their partner down. And if they did, their partner would have had the right to hold them accountable. You know, research like this, it suggests that we indeed are better together than we are in isolation. The church is here to help us. We are better when we are devoted together, just as the early church was. The church is a family, a support system, a vital part of our spiritual journey. The early church was devoted together to corporate worship, and corporate worship prepares us to live lives of daily worship. They were devoted together to celebrating the Lord's Supper and the witness that we share when we partake each Sunday. We are proclaiming a message of hope and love when we come together to remember Jesus' death in our place. They were devoted together to encouraging each other, and we all need encouragement from time to time. They were devoted together to fellowship, which brought them together. They were a true community together. They were devoted together by serving one another within the church and within their community. They were devoted together to spreading the good news of the gospel of grace to everyone. And as they were sharing, God added to their number. This morning I pray that we will all be devoted together as God's congregation here on the mountain. May we be an example to our community. May we be aware and see the opportunities to share our faith and to live as visible witnesses of the power of God's love and of God's grace. This morning, may we truly be devoted together.